So the internet's full of musicians and fans expressing their grief and I think shock is the best word over this unexpected news of Neil Peart's death. I should pronounce it Peart, but I've always pronounced it Peart. But I wanted to post something yesterday, and I every time I started to, I felt really silly, and I felt silly for being so emotionally distraught. But waking up this morning, I'm seeing just this onslaught of videos on YouTube and Facebook, and all of guys like Rick Beato and Dave Grohl, crying and just expressing a lot of emotion about this. So I guess I feel a little less silly. I've lost friends and family members who are very close, and I don't post videos about it. But I guess this being a more public thing, I feel compelled for whatever reason. My Facebook feed yesterday was just like I couldn't get through 3 posts without something about the loss of Neil Peart, and then my phone started blowing up, and so I was just having a rough time, but I don't feel so alone now that I'm seeing some of these other guys my age just dismayed over this and kind of at a loss. So someone in my feed compared it to the loss of John Lennon, which I can't speak to because I was a kid when Lennon was shot, and I didn't really have a lot of awareness of him at the time. But I think that statement's probably more true for musicians than I don't want to assume, but I think more for musicians than the general public, who may just be aware of the band or a couple of songs by them or not at all. And I had more thoughts and emotions than I could really, that I knew it just wouldn't wrap up in a tidy Facebook post. So I think one of the things that does make this such a significant thing for musicians, as I've thought about it, is and especially if you're a drummer, but if you're a musician in general, you've kind of followed Neil's career, and you've been very aware of him. He's a very private person. He was a very private person. So we watched him in the mid-aughts. Mid-aughts, go through this very tragic and public loss of his wife and daughter in a very short period of time. I think it was just within months. His daughter was killed in a car accident, and then his wife passed away from cancer. And it happened really quickly and probably more publicly than he was comfortable with. And he just disappeared. He got on his motorcycle and was just gone for the better, I think, over a year, and nobody knew. Your thought was, well, what about what's going to happen with Rush? Is it over? But that was really secondary to, oh my God, I hope we don't, get news of his body being found at the bottom of a gorge somewhere or something, because he was, nobody knew what he was really going through or how he was dealing with it. So, the fact that he's now passed away from brain cancer, I think is, just kind of an extra twist of the knife, I guess, in a way. Of course he did come back, and the band came back. They did this incredible album called Vapor Trails, and he wrote a book called Ghost Rider that came out around the same time. Ghost Rider was the title of one of the songs on the album, and in both of those he's just really expressing his thoughts about the frailty of life and his place in the world and relationships and just so many things that it'd be too much to go into here. But I really can't overstate the importance of both that album and book to my transplant struggles, and particularly just the losses that took place leading up to the hospitalizations and then dealing with the backside of that. There just wasn't time. There's so much music. I could write a whole other book about the music that kind of sustained me and that I listened to going through all that. Vapor Trails was certainly one of the big ones, and it's just Neil's reflections on all of that. It wasn't the first time that his lyrics had helped me through difficult transitions. For those who don't know, I think I may have mentioned it, but he was also the lyricist for Rush on 17 of their, I think it's 18 studio albums. So I shared that commonality with him, in that I started out as a drummer, but I was writing lyrics almost as soon as I was playing drums. And there's not many lyric writing or songwriting drummers out there. And you'll hear a lot in the media about him drawing from Ayn Rand and sci-fi and Lord of the Rings and all this, but which is really stupid. The media didn't keep up with Rush much at all. That was really more back in the 70s as the band matured and got older. His lyric writing did as well, and this is the same music media that they'll hold him up as an icon and heap all these accolades upon him and the band, but they were they ostracized and blackballed and ridiculed him for decades. So while the band probably accepts all of that, and Neil would have accepted all of that with just a kind of a gracious nod, the fans don't have a lot of love for the media when it comes to that. So don't believe a lot of what you read, or try to look beyond it. If maybe the news stories and some of this inspires you to check out their music. I came to Rush much later in life than most of my peers. I was in my mid-20s. It was the Counterparts album, and this Stick It Out single on the radio is what got me into them, because I was a metal guy, and that was a really aggressive sounding songs. But you have to think this was an era where people like me, who grew up listening to 80s music and playing 80s music, and that was our sensibility. Things were changing radically. I mean, grunge and alternative rock had just cut this swath through all of that. And so, I was trying to navigate that and figure out, well, what do I do now? And here was this band that I had been just marginally aware of, who was not afraid to adopt the current trends and get into what was going on at the time. But it was more of an adaptation than an adoption, if you will. Like, they were true to themselves. They still sounded like themselves. And they were unafraid to do that. You can follow their whole career, which is a daunting task because it was like 40 plus years. But they never compromised who they were. They not with record labels, not with the media, not with even with fans who wanted them to do the same album over and over and over again. They kept changing and exploring, and that was really inspirational for me at that time. They we call them the world's biggest indie band. You got to consider, I think they're like the third best selling band in the world, but so many people can't even name one of their songs. They literally built it, and millions came and said, hey, we'll accept this like it is. No window dressing, no image consultants, none of that. They were just who they were, and they had little to no help from MTV, certainly no help from Rolling Stone and the press media, but the fans knew who they were. And that was just a huge thing for me at that moment in time, trying to navigate these changes that were going on. For me personally, Neil, I think of him as someone who was a truth seeker. That sounds kind of corny, but like, he was always looking for nuggets of things that were true. And if you find those things, hold on to those things. As he aged, so did the maturity and the depth of his lyrics. He asked a lot of uncomfortable questions, and it made me very uncomfortable listening to his lyrics at first. He challenged my thinking in ways that no one had before. And I think, along with the writings of Terry Pratchett, he was largely responsible for a very massive shift in my worldview around the time that the Vapor Trails album came out, 2004 or 5, whatever it was. Neil and Terry Pratchett, they very gently kind of forced me, if you will, to reevaluate a lot of what I arrogantly assumed I knew about everything, in your 20s, and I just thought I knew everything about everything. And it led to me making a lot of very kind of radical life decisions that probably, I think, for me, like, saved my sanity. I think I was going crazy from cognitive dissonance because I thought certain things were true, but my experience didn't bear that out, and I didn't know how to reconcile any of that. And Neil had a way of just sticking his finger right in the middle of things like that. you know, it probably saved me from myself in a lot of ways. I think the big thing for me was that I was just not really dealing with the reality of uh, my health situation at the time. I don't think I had the tools to do that. And here was this guy that said, you have to you have to look at what's true, and you have to deal with the reality of the situation rather than what you want it to be. You want things to be a certain way, they're not. Deal with what is. And he lived his life that way, and he encouraged other people to do the same thing through his lyric writing. He wasn't a preacher, he wasn't on any kind of crusade. But I marked the beginning of my obsession with Rush as the moment I really began to think like an adult and really being purposeful in forming my political opinions and my thoughts about belief systems and religion and mortality. And I'm just at a loss to express how huge that was for me at the time. I could say the same thing about Terry Pratchett, who we lost a few years ago, but the fact that Neil managed to do this as a drummer, for me was such a big deal. It just hit me exactly where I was, and that same thoughtfulness was present in all of his work, but especially in his lyrics as he got older. It was a really sad day for fans and again, musicians. I think especially a few years ago when the band announced their retirement. They were still in their prime by all accounts. They just released what some would argue was the best album of their career. And it just occurred to me this morning or last night rather, that Neil may probably, if I'm thinking about the timeline, he probably knew about this diagnosis at the time that they announced that, but he was so private and he wouldn't have wanted the attention, which is why everybody's in shock now learning that he's been battling brain cancer for 3.5 years. It's just completely out of the blue. I'm very sad about it, obviously, and just not processing. But I look at his body of work. You look at the music with the band. A big thing to me was when he did the Burning for Buddy, the Buddy Rich tribute albums, pulling all this old music out of the vaults and making this whole generation of drummers aware of where their roots were. Which got me interested in big band and fusion and some things like that. And there's a whole, path that so many people took that was different from the one they were on as a result of him exposing us to those things. And he was the only one, he was the only drummer that had the profile to be able to do that. And he had such a love for Buddy Rich and Krupa and some of these guys that beyond, my dad mentioning them to me a few times, I would have never had any idea. So, I look at that. I look at, the books that he wrote. He had all these travel books that he wrote, and just this constant desire to learn more about the drums, to be a better drummer, better musician. Even after he was known as the greatest drummer in the world, he was still taking drum lessons, and just the impact that drive had on drummers, on me as a drummer. And I look at all that and I think, he ended well, which is something I cannot say for so many of my drumming heroes like Keith Moon or Bonzo, or for that matter, a lot of the guys that we've lost, these iconic performers like Chris Cornell or Prince and George Michael. I don't think I'll ever be able to listen to a Chris Cornell song and smile, because there's just always that nasty twist at the end because of the way his life ended. But there won't be that with with Neil. I hope there won't be. He stayed the course. The band stayed the course. He maintained a very high expectation of himself, and he never gave in to that whole rock star prima donna thing, and he could have. He was literally the greatest drummer of this era of music, probably since Gene Krupa or Buddy Rich. He never gave into that. He was first and foremost an artist, and I think those of us who have been so affected by his life and his work, we're going to go into this weekend rehearsing and gigging and recording and writing and all this, and you have to carry that example with you. You have to, look at that and expect more of yourself. So I'm very sad, and I feel kind of stupid being sad, and words are very inept to express those emotions that surround all of it. But as so many others have said in the last 12 hours, you feel compelled to say something. And I'm not concise, so I knew it wouldn't fit in a Facebook post. I can't think of any way to kind of cap my thoughts. I remember the lyrics from, which I guess arguably you could say it's the last song that he left with us. It's the final track from Clockwork Angels, their last album called The Garden, and we knew it was their last album at the time. He says, the future disappears into memory with only a moment in between. Forever dwells in that moment. Hope is what remains to be seen. And I could quote so many lyrics from songs like The Pass or Free Will, or there's just so many, Totem Pole, and on and on. And I get emotional even without all of this that's happened, talking about those lyrics, because they just have such a personal meaning to me, and hung on to them at times of very dark despair and difficult things that were going on. But that's really all I know to say, and thanks for listening. Anybody who made it all the way through this, I guess that's all I have to say. Thanks.